Now, in this time slot, I've always felt it's important to give my own unique views, not just to repeat everything that's been going on all day. Otherwise, why listen? Why put aside everything that you're doing and listening to this program? This actually has to be appointment radio. 3 p.m. on the West Coast, 6 p.m. on the East Coast. People have a lot of things to do. And so I give you my thoughts. You may not always agree with them. Many of you do agree with them. And I watched last night's debate after the program, and I watched the first hour, going back to it, which was aired during the last hour of my program. And you know what? I watched last night's debate not so much to hear what the candidates had to say in particular, because I think by now we know who they are. No, I watched it to see if this tag team that I've been talking about for the last many weeks and emphasized the last 2 days, this tag team tactic with Mitt Romney and Ron Paul would occur again. And wouldn't you know, like clockwork, as in the case of Michelle Bachmann and Rick Perry and Newt Gingrich and Al Santorum, Ron Paul attacks the conservative who most threatens Romney, Mitt Romney attacks that same conservative, and Paul and Romney say nothing of each other's records and statements. And so it is that the conservative who's targeted is then said to look defensive, intemperate, unprepared, and the debate's loser. And yet the conservative who's targeted really has three only options in that format: to just sit there and smile stupidly, to actually defend him or herself from the attacks, and or go on the offensive against both of his or her accusers, and then be said to be defensive and intemperate. That's been the game. The problem is that tag team attack makes it difficult for the targeted conservative to get their message out. Their records are cherry-picked, and they're hit with these attacks repeatedly. So many that the format, oh, you have 30 seconds to respond, doesn't allow an adequate response under any of the circumstances. It appears that even the Washington Compost figured this out, because around 10:30, 30 minutes after the debate, they had a blog post which said, look at that, they're tag teaming. MSLSD has now figured it out. Now, there are a couple of things I want to do today for those of you who remain really curious about all this, why it's occurring, and whether you approve of it. Now, for the most part, what has been said since last night is that Romney was steady and benefited most from the debate. Santorum was defensive and lost ground. Newt did the best, but he's not that relevant anymore. I'm saying this is what the common wisdom of today is. And Ron Paul was having a grand old time. This is pretty much what's been going on all day in terms of what the commentators are saying. I actually believe Newt did the best because he wasn't the target, and that allowed him to shine. Romney did not do as well as is being spun by the establishment. Santorum did not do as badly as is being spun by the establishment. And Ron Paul has been the key attack dog from the start, the attack dog with the mission to kneecap any conservative, challenge their conservative credentials. And so now he's the guy who sits there and claims to have the standard for conservatives in public office. And if they don't measure up to his standard, they're not conservatives. A man who 20 years ago rejected Reagan and the Republican Party, ran for president as a libertarian, and trashed conservatism. He's now the guy who gets to measure everybody else, which benefits Romney, because he won't take Romney's measure. So let me underscore that, in fact, there is this Paul-Romney coordination, which means the most establishment-oriented of the candidates and the most anarchistic libertarian of the candidates have joined forces. I'm very curious to know what you Romney supporters and Paul supporters think about this. Particularly you Ron Paul supporters. Is this not a sellout, or is this perfectly fine by you? And doesn't it also mean that Ron Paul really has no intention of winning or doesn't think he can win? Because he's Romney's wingman in these debates? Maybe he just seeks a prominent role for him or his son at the convention, or as we talked about yesterday from that article out of Kentucky, maybe he's hoping, or Romney's waving in front of his nose, the possibility of Rand Paul maybe as a VP candidate or in the cabinet, or who knows what. I'm just curious to know also whether this debate has influenced any of you in your decisions. Did anything really happen here that makes a difference? I know the media want it to make a difference. I know what the media want. I know what the Republican establishment wants. I want to know from you, however, if it affected you in some significant way that you're going to change your mind. Now, from yesterday's show, I rarely do this, but I need it to set the stage. From yesterday's show, cut one, go. I've been talking the last few weeks about this curious partnership or allegiance or alliance or whatever you want to call it between Mitt Romney and Ron Paul, who I don't think could be further apart. And Ron Paul has basically been Mitt Romney's wingman, and what he's done is he's spent a fortune attacking one conservative after another. Bachmann, with ads saying she's no conservative. Perry, he's no conservative. Gingrich, he's no conservative. Santorum, he's no conservative. This coming from a libertarian, of course. But that said, no such ads against Romney. Romney, who's been pretty much the front runner from the beginning, even though he's had some bumps in the roads, including most recently. So why? So why, I asked. Here's cut two from yesterday's show. Go. The point is, you notice how he will not even politely criticize Romney. And I've been asking myself, what is this? What, so he can get a speaking part at the convention? What is being offered? Maybe nothing, but maybe he's hoping something. Many people today have sent me a link to a national public radio affiliate in Kentucky, WFPL, and a piece by Kenny Colston. And it reads as follows, and maybe this is it. Kentucky's junior senator says it would be an honor to be considered as a possible running mate for Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney. By the way, I think Rand Paul would be a good vice president. But that's, again, beside the point. This may be something that Ron Paul is hoping for, that he believes Romney will be the nominee, and he would like his son to be the vice presidential nominee. And so he's not attacking Romney. And by the way, I'm live now. I have no idea if that's the case. None. That was in an article the other day. And then Stephen Hayes on Fox News this week, hat tip right scoop. He has even more information. Cut four, go.
There is a de facto alliance between Ron Paul and Mitt Romney. There's no question about it. At this point, it's an open partnership. I mean, Jesse Benton, Ron Paul's campaign manager, has talked about the extent to which they're cooperating with the Romney campaign. He said that there are weekly phone calls.
Okay,
they
I
have
get
good
that part.
relations.
Where's the reason?
Because if Mitt Romney, if this in fact goes as long as I think it will go, goes through June, maybe to the convention, and Mitt Romney is short delegates, let's say he doesn't get to 1144, Ron Paul will be steadily accumulating delegates in caucus states and elsewhere that may be enough eventually to put Romney over the top, or to have some kind of an impact, or at least to give Ron Paul a speaking spot at the convention.
So now it's out in the open for everybody to see. And it's been going on for months. It's been going on since this summer. But it's even more than what Stephen Hayes says. It's even more than what I've speculated myself. And when we come back, I'll explain. When we come back in just a few minutes.
Mark Levin.
Now, folks, I'm going to walk through this as I have been step by step by step, as a good litigator would. And I'm going to go through this. And one of the things that saddens me, and it really does, is how weak the conservative intellectual bench has become and how gutless it has become. Folks like to throw around William F. Buckley Jr.'s name, but Buckley had courage, in addition to being brilliant. And so much of that courage is missing today. So I want to take you through a few steps here to begin with, and we'll have the break at the bottom of the hour, and we will continue it. Conservatism, generally speaking, and this more radical form of libertarianism, and it's not mainstream traditional libertarianism, radical libertarianism, have always been at dagger points. Now, they've had alliances from time to time, but more dagger points than alliances. One of the mentors to Ron Paul, who he considered one of the greats, was an economist by the name of Murray Rothbard. You can Google this. As a matter of fact, we're going to link to this article in the American Thinker from last year. Murray Rothbard was an anarchist, pretty much. He was a radical libertarian, and a lot of libertarians rejected him. But Ron Paul embraced him, as did Ron Paul's chief of staff, Lew Rockwell, as do many others who surround Ron Paul. And the vile newsletters that you hear about all the time and so forth, those were also influenced by Rothbard and Rockwell and so forth, and reviewed by Ron Paul before they were released. So who's Murray Rothbard? He's treated like a saint among the anarchist libertarian wing. Like a saint. And in a tribute to Rothbard when he died in 1995, Ron Paul wrote, "I love talking to this down-to-earth genius, and he told me he enjoyed meeting a congressman who had not only read his books, but used them as a guide in his votes and legislation. A close and lasting friendship was the result, which wasn't hard. Murray was the sweetest, funniest, most generous of men." Now, a moving tribute to a man, as the American Thinker's piece goes, who came to hate conservatism. A man who rallied against the traditionalist philosophy, the virtues espoused by the father of modern conservatism, Edmund Burke, the father of American conservatism, Russell Kirk, and the greatest promoter of American conservatism, William F. Buckley Jr., who is despised by the Ron Paul so-called brain trust. And upon the death of Murray Rothbard, William Buckley wrote the following. Murray Rothbard, age 68, died on January 7. We extend condolences to his family, but not to the movement that he inspired. Murray Rothbard had defective judgment. It pains even to recall it. But in 1959, when Nikita Khrushchev arrived in New York, with much of America stunned by the visit of the Butcher of Budapest, the Soviet protege of Stalin who was threatening a world war over Berlin, Rothbard physically applauded Khrushchev in his limousine as it passed by on the street. He gave as his reason for this that, after all, Khrushchev had killed fewer people than General Dwight Eisenhower, his host. It was a great pity, but his problem ought not to be thought of as tracing to the seamless integrity of libertarian principles. In Murray's case, much of what drove him was a contrarian spirit, the deranging scrupulosity that caused him to disdain, among others, Reagan, Friedman, Hoover, and yes, Newt Gingrich, while huffing and puffing in the little cloister whose halls he labored so strenuously to contract, leaving him in the end not as the father of a swelling movement that roused the masses from their slumber, as he once stated his ambition, but with about as many disciples as David Koresh had in his little redoubt in Waco. Yet Murray Rothbard believed in freedom, and yes, David Koresh believed in God. So Buckley didn't mince words. Rothbard had turned his back on the conservative movement, and at times on the idea of America itself. He and his followers were, and should continue to be, persona non grata in the conservative movement, writes William Upton a year ago, a former libertarian and involved in communications in the Washington, D.C. area. Mary Rothbard, Ron Paul. Mary Rothbard considered Ronald Reagan a warmonger. That was the title of a piece he wrote about Ronald Reagan, and that was published on the Lew Rockwell website. He also considered Abraham Lincoln, as do many of those acolytes who surround Ron Paul at the senior level, the worst president in American history, a butcher. And yet most of you consider him one of the greatest presidents in American history, and most Republicans consider him the greatest Republican, if not one of the greatest Republicans. Stick with me. Step by step, I'm going to explain what seems to confound so many people. We'll be right back. So no conservative can live up to Ron Paul's standards because Ron Paul's standards are libertarian anarchy. They're not constitutionalism. You need to study Mary Rothbard. Just Google it. Go to Lew Rockwell's site, and you will see. And go elsewhere on your own. So there we have on stage Ron Paul. So Rick saying to him, you're a fake. But he feels that way about Bachmann. He ran ads essentially saying the same thing against her in Iowa. He ran ads against Perry, saying essentially the same thing against him. Ran ads against Gingrich, saying essentially the same thing against him. This is what he does as they coordinate with the Romney campaign, and what Stephen Hayes of Fox News says is now well out in the open. And yet we picked up on it watching this coordination going on, and we've talked about it many times here. But if Ronald Reagan had been sitting on that stage last night, here is what Ron Paul would have said to him. This is a letter Ron Paul issued in 1987. In 1987, when he resigned from the Republican Party to run as the presidential nominee of the Libertarian Party. And by the way, then he came back to the Republican Party and was running ads against Rick Perry, claiming that he was Ronald Reagan's favorite. This is the letter in part, 1987, Ron Paul, when he resigned the Republican Party to run as the Libertarian nominee, or to seek it and then run as it. He said, as a lifelong Republican, it saddens me to have to write this letter. My parents believed in the Republican Party and its free enterprise philosophy. And that's the way I was brought up. At age 21 in 1956, I cast my first vote for Ike and the entire Republican slate. Since 1981, however, I've gradually and steadily grown weary of the Republican Party's efforts to reduce the size of the federal government. Now, 1981 would be obviously when Reagan came into office. Since then, Ronald Reagan and the Republican Party have given us skyrocketing deficits and, astoundingly, a doubled national debt. How is that the party of balanced budgets? With the control of the White House and Senate, accumulated red ink greater than all previous administrations put together? Tip O'Neill, although part of the problem, cannot be blamed. Knowing his administration's record, I wasn't surprised by its Libyan disinformation campaign, Israeli-Iranian arms for hostages swap, or illegal funding of the Contras. All this has contributed to my disenchantment with the Republican Party and helped me make up my mind. I want to totally disassociate myself from the policies that have given us unprecedented deficits, massive monetary inflation, indiscriminate military spending, and irrational and unconstitutional foreign policy, zooming federal aid, the exaltation of international banking, and the attack on our personal liberties and privacy. He's talking about Reagan. I conclude that one must look to other avenues if a successful effort is ever to be achieved in reversing America's direction. I therefore resign my membership in the Republican Party and enclose my membership card. I don't have a membership card to the Republican Party per se. I guess I have a voter registration card, but do we hand out Republican Party cards? Anyway, Ronald Reagan doesn't measure up. Doesn't measure up to Ron Paul. Ron Paul despises Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln doesn't measure up to Ron Paul. Michelle Bachmann doesn't measure up to Ron Paul. Rick Perry doesn't measure up to Ron Paul. Oh, another one. Herman Cain doesn't measure up to Ron Paul. Newt Gingrich doesn't measure up to Ron Paul. And, of course, Rick Santorum doesn't measure up to Ron Paul because Ron Paul is not your traditional libertarian. He's a libertarian anarchist like his mentor, close friend, Murray Rothbard, who William F. Buckley had nothing but disdain for. Because Rothbard had nothing but disdain for conservatives, who he called authoritarians. These labels matter because they're being used against you. So no conservative can live up to a standard that's not a conservative standard. We're not talking about anarchy. We're not talking about the Articles of Confederation. They trash Edmund Burke. They trash Lincoln. They trash Reagan. If you go on that site, the Lou Rockwell site, they've trashed Antonin Scalia, among others. And, of course, Buckley. Buckley, who wanted nothing to do with them. Why our friends at National Review and the Weekly Standard and other places don't get more deeply into this, I don't know, but they should, because it's important. Forget about the polls and the surveys and who's winning today, who's up and who's down. Come on, boys. Let's get into some of the solid stuff now. So what do Romney and Paul have in common? Their contempt. Their contempt for conservatives. Now, many of you who support Romney are thinking, well, what's the contempt? Romney started off this primary not to embrace the conservative base, but to dismiss it, or to assume it would follow along while he was already tracking to the center. Now he's having to track back, and remarkably, he's attacking the conservatives along with Ron Paul from the right. He claims to be an outsider when all these insiders are endorsing him. I mean, I'm amazed to hear this. He opposes No Child Left Behind. Great. Did he say it at the time? I'm going to play a clip where he supported it at the time. Is the Bush family listening? Is Karl Rove listening? That's one of their marquee programs, like it or not. And by the way, every Republican senator but 3 liberal Republicans voted for No Child Left Behind because it was viewed, rightly or wrongly in my view, but it was viewed as a way to rein in the National Education Association, that is the teachers union. That's how it was viewed in the Senate. That's why even Phil Gramm voted for it. I'm not defending it. I have no reason to defend it. I'm explaining it. Medicare Part D, which I opposed, and the Republican establishment supported. I would have to ask Mitt Romney and his supporters, do you support repealing it? Do you want to repeal Medicare Part D? I do, by the way. I think that whole damn thing needs to be reformed. But has Romney campaigned on repealing it? No. Why? Because he believes in it. That's why. But what amazes me are the Ron Paul supporters not really understanding. Forget about his senior people. I'm talking about you folks out there who support him. Do you realize he's made this deal? That they're coordinating with each other? Because of their contempt for conservatives? The establishment wants Romney. The libertarian anarchists are making their bed with Romney as a way into power of some kind. Because Buckley was right in irrelevancy. But he takes on the mantle of conservatism while trying to destroy the conservatives. One by one in this race. Now, Joe Scarborough was all confused about this morning on the Morning Schmo on MSLSD. Cut 3, go.
I think the thing that went unspoken, but everybody knows, and that is that Mitt Romney and Ron Paul have formed an alliance. It is such an obvious alliance that Mitt Romney would do well to just come out and admit it. I don't know what
Well, isn't it interesting? Only after I've been talking about it did the Morning Schmo figure this. Oh, it's so obvious. Oh, it's so obvious. Well, this is the first time you've brought it up, Schmo. I know it pains you to admit where you hear these things and to give attribution. Go ahead.
Promised Ron Paul. I don't know if Ron Paul's hoping that his son gets in the administration, but let's just be really honest here. For all people, for Ron Paul to form an alliance with in the Republican Party, to pick out Mitt Romney is really bizarre.
No, it's not, unless you're a superficial hack host who really doesn't look any deeper and just copies what other people say. Ron Paul has contempt for traditional conservatives, contempt for Buckley, contempt for Reagan, contempt for Lincoln, contempt, by the way, for Milton Friedman. He just wasn't enough for them, Milton Friedman. I'm not done. We're going to do this step by step. I think we conservatives, we need to pay attention to this. We must pay attention. You got to put aside the, hey, who's winning? Who do I support? Just put it aside and let's think this stuff through and talk it through together. And I will be taking calls next hour, but I'm not done. By the way, I'm just thankful these debates are done because the commenting on them, right after the debate, and it goes on all day long, it's so superficial. And to what end? To what end at this point? So you can have a tag team up there? Now, I'm going to play some clips from Ron Paul in the past, including one clip actually from last night, and I'm going to play some Mitt Romney clips from the past, some of them recent past. If you're a Paul supporter, Romney supporter, don't get mad. Just listen. I'm not doing imitations of them. These are your guys. And you may have explanations and arguments, and that's perfectly fine, but that's not even my point. My point is that these guys are way outside of the traditional conservative mainstream. Both of them. Both of them, if truth be told, which is why they team up and attack the conservatives. I don't care who Jim Talent or Chris Christie or Karl Rove supports. We're not a cult of personality around here. We're thinkers. We're individual thinkers. We're rational human beings. So here's Ron Paul, 1988. Mark, 1988? Yes. When he quit the Republican Party, trashed Reagan, decided to run for president on the Libertarian Party. Look, we can dig up, Santorum statements to a religious group and then talk about Satan for 3 days. I think we can handle this for about 45 seconds. So here we are, Ron Paul on the Morton Downey Jr. show. Remember that? Back in 1988, YouTube, cut 12, go.
Wouldn't it be a wonderful thing for this guy to be president and get into a debate with somebody from Russia? Can you hear this guy screaming?
At least I wouldn't be from George Bush and the CIA and dealing in drugs, right?
Stop. Did you hear that? At least I wouldn't be from George Bush and the CIA dealing in drugs, right? I mean, I want you to understand the paranoia and the contempt. Not just for an out-of-control government, but a contempt for American society. Go ahead.
Right? Yeah, George Bush and the CIA dealing in drugs. It'll be a lot better debate.
Before we start to legalize drugs, Mort, I would like to at least...
legalize freedom. We don't want to legalize drugs. We want to legalize freedom. Freedom of choice. 50% of the people in prisons have to rob in order to get the money to buy the drugs. To keep the CIA fighting their illegal war.
All right, let's stop. So, isn't it interesting? Everybody's digging up audio, comments, 20, 30 years ago, junior high, whatever. And here we have Ron Paul accusing George Bush and the CIA dealing in drugs. This is why Bill Buckley wanted nothing to do with these guys. This is crackpots. Crackpotism, I guess I'll coin a phrase. Go ahead.
Loudmouth number two. Mr. Ostrowski, would you?
We keep going back to Bush and the CIA and the illegal war. It was the liberal Congress, Mr. President, that caused the existence of... Thank you. It was the liberal Congress that caused Ollie North to have to go over on an Irish passport.
And disobey the Constitution is what he did.
And the fact that a nut like you can run.
Tear the Constitution up and threw it in the trash.
That's either right or it's wrong, and you're wrong.
The fact that a nut like you can
record war, raise the money in trust, and destroy.
All right, there's too much yelling going on there. But that said, so Bush and the CIA were dealing in drugs. Ollie North destroyed the Constitution. There's no evidence for that whatsoever, not even in a court of law. The people who were destroying the Constitution were the prosecutors and the independent counsel who violated the Fourth Amendment, among other things, when they were trying to railroad Ollie North. But I'm not going to get into all that. I'm just making a point. But Paul goes on to say on this program that we fight these wars with illegal drug money. Cut 13, go.
I think we deserve a minute on what you indicate. You said if the libertarians in charge, there would be no America. Clearly, let me challenge some of you who may be even leaning toward the conservative philosophy. Ask me why we still finance the communists. Ask me why 70% of the military budget is spent overseas. Ask me why the good airplanes are overseas and the lousy airplanes are not here the lousy airplanes are in the Air National Guard. I would say clean out the State Department, spend more money on our national defense, have an anti-communist policy, don't sign these treaties with the Soviet, don't extend loans to the Soviet Union, and not to fight these wars with the funds we raise from the illegal drugs. So
right, stop. See, there's always a little kernel of truth in what he says. But then there's the whack job stuff. Fight these illegal wars with illegal drug money. I have no idea what drug money he's talking about. Do you? And and it must be an enormous amount of it since we're fighting wars with it. Among other things. And then in the debate yesterday, the old Ron Paul, when it comes to Iran, just can't help himself. Iran is run by an Islamo-Nazi regime that just sentenced a Christian pastor, to death because he dared to convert from Islam. And they do a lot worse than that. They slaughter people right on the street. Here he is, cut 14, go.
I disagree because we don't know if they have a weapon. Matter of fact, there's no evidence.
All right, let's
that
stop.
They have.
Let's stop. We will continue this next. There's no evidence that Iran has nuclear weapons. So now we need to have a Kodak moment where we have a picture of a nuclear weapon that Iran has before we consider striking Iran, which we know for a fact is developing nuclear weapons. And as you will hear next hour when I play Ron Paul, he says, well, for crying out loud, in essence, of course they need nuclear weapons. They're being provoked. So which is it? We need evidence that they have one. We need evidence that they're building one. What are we waiting for? We're waiting for nothing. Ron Paul doesn't have a problem with them arming up because it's America's fault. That's why. I'll be right back. I try to take these issues head on. I'm not trying to duck it. I'm not trying to play nice. I'm not trying to play mean. I'm not trying to be controversial. I'm trying to convey to you what I know to be in my own research and reasoning. So why hold back? Why not explain it? So as I was explaining, Ron Paul despises conservatives. This is not an opinion. This is fact. You can go to LouRockwell.com. Also, you need to Google Ron Paul's name, Google his 1987 letter to Ronald Reagan. As I said in the first hour, had Ronald Reagan been sitting next to Ron Paul at the debate last night, he would have been trashed as not being a conservative, as being a fake, and Romney would have joined in too, attacking him from the right. There's just no question about it. I can bring Michael Reagan on here, he'd tell you the same thing. And he has nothing but contempt for Abraham Lincoln. And the reason is Ron Paul is a libertarian anarchist, not a traditional libertarian, not a typical libertarian, which is why you often see pieces in Reason Magazine or Reason Online, which is a libertarian site, that are critical of him, critical of his past, critical of his newsletters. So I'm trying to bring this information to the fore. I know I'm going against all the outlets, all the news outlets, but what's amazing about this information's all available. You can test me on everything I'm saying. Plus, on my own website, marklevinshow.com, we link to everything that we use. We provide you with the original source information, don't we, Mr. Producer? So nothing here is contrived. So I've played you a few clips so far of Ron Paul going on and on about George Bush and the CIA using illegally begotten drug money to run illegal wars. It's about 20 years ago. And going on and attacking Oliver North for violating the Constitution and so forth. But Ron Paul also, at last night's debate yesterday, you can see this every now and then just popping up again, particularly when it comes to the Islamo-Nazi regime in Tehran, Iran. That it's America's fault. It's the hate America first mentality. That the Islamo-Nazis who seek to destroy us, and in fact have murdered thousands and thousands of our citizens, well, they're provoked by us. Just as the Soviets were provoked by us. Just as the communists in the Western Hemisphere, in Latin America, were provoked by us. Because he doesn't like the Union that much, which is why he despises Abraham Lincoln. Ladies and gentlemen, you got to look at this stuff. Everybody thinks, he's like the crazy uncle in the attic or in the basement. No, he's not. He represents, as William F. Buckley Jr. said of his mentor, Murray Rothbard, this vile little community, which is having an enormous impact on our youth. I think. Which is why you need to know about it. So here he is at last night's debate regarding Iran. Cut 14, go.
I disagree because we don't know if they have a weapon. Matter of fact, there's no evidence that they have it. There is no evidence. Israel claims they do not have it, and our government doesn't. I don't want them to get a weapon, but I think what we're doing is encouraging them to have a weapon because they feel threatened. If you look at a map of Iran, we have 45 bases around their country plus our submarines. The Iranians can't possibly attack anybody, and we're worrying about the possibility of one nuclear weapon. Now, just think about the Cold War. The Soviets had 30,000 of them, and we talked to them. The Soviets killed 100 million people, and the Chinese, and we worked our way out of it. And if you want to worry about nuclear weapons, worry about the nuclear weapons that were left over from the Soviet Union. They're still floating around.
He's always diverting, always restating history. If we could have stopped the Soviets from getting one atomic weapon, don't you think we would have? But Iran's not the Soviet Union. Iran is an Islamo-Nazi, third world, banana republic dictatorship. That's number one. Number two, I believe we've tried talking to these people, starting with Carter and beyond. This president, too, doesn't seem to be working very well. Number three, we're surrounding them with 45 bases. Oh, right. 45 bases. We could have attacked Iran 100 times in the last week, and we haven't. What do the 45 bases have to do with anything? We have bases in the Middle East not just because of Iran. We have bases in the Middle East so we can project ourselves where we need to fight the pirates, Somalia, to keep various shipping lanes open, to refuel our ships, and on and on and on. But he makes it sound like there's a quid pro quo of some kind here, that we, the bad guys, are surrounding them, provoking them, and so, of course, they got to get a nuclear weapon. I mean, it's preposterous. Now, here's Ron Paul, one more, mercilessly, on Meet the Depressed, December 23, 2007. I just want to undermine this point. And I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would say. I mean, other than missing Tim Russert, the human being, I miss Tim Russert, the journalist. Not because he was perfect, not because he wasn't biased, but he was tough. He was tough. Here we have Tim Russert, 2007, not that long ago, a little over 4 years ago, December 23rd, questioning Ron Paul. Cut 15, go.
And yet, you divorced yourself from Ronald Reagan. You said this: although he was once an ardent supporter of President Reagan, Paul now speaks of him as a traitor, leading the country in the debt and conflicts around the world. I want to totally disassociate myself from the Reagan administration. And you go on to the Dallas Morning News. Paul now calls Reagan a dramatic failure.
Well, I'll bet you any money I didn't use the word traitor. I bet you that's somebody else, so I think that's misleading. But a failure, yes. In many ways, the government didn't shrink. Ultimately, after he got in office, he said, all I want to do is reduce the rate of increase in size of the government. That's not my goal. My goal is to reduce our government to a constitutional size, completely different.
Well, you know what's interesting about this? We don't elect dictators, at least we haven't. Ronald Reagan couldn't wave a magic wand and reduce the size of government, but he did do a lot and move the nation in this direction. He did a lot and moved the nation in this direction. He tried to get rid of the Department of Education. Republicans stopped him. He didn't have the House. He put in place the most dramatic, across-the-board tax cuts in modern American history. He did a lot of these things. He shut down the government 3 different times, maybe more, because he was tired of omnibus spending bills. But he doesn't have the line item veto. There's a lot of things Reagan wanted to do and tried to do. What he did is build a foundation for the next Republican president. That would be George H.W. Bush, who turned his back on Reaganism and went for a kinder and gentler America, quote unquote. So one president in 8 years on the Republican side built a foundation for future Republican presidents, a foundation rejected by Bush 41 and Bush 43, in my humble opinion. That's how our system works, or doesn't work. And Ron Paul knows it, because he's been in the House for 20 years and has been utterly ineffective. Not one piece of legislation that he proposed of any significance became law. And yet Reagan was a failure. Now he'd say, well, what can I do? I'm one of many. Well, what could Reagan do except what he tried to do? But that's my point, folks. He is measuring what conservatism is when he's not a conservative. So the greatest elected conservative in modern history is a failure. So of course to him, Michelle Bachmann, Rick Perry, Herman Cain, Newt Gingrich, Rick Santorum, they're all failures. None of them can live up to the pre-Civil War, really pre-constitutional Articles of Confederation type society that Ron Paul's talking about. None of them. Now that's Ron Paul. So we know why he's involved in trying to attack the leading conservative challenging Mitt Romney. So what's Mitt Romney up to? So I can piss off everybody. And by the way, maybe it's time that Rick Santorum and Newt Gingrich figure out how to build an alliance to beat back this alliance. I think it is. I think they should think about something. I'm not talking about debates. There are no more debates. But these two guys are hanging out there the way Bachmann did and Perry did and the rest of them did by themselves while we have an alliance here between the establishment, believe it or not, and the libertarian anarchists in a movement against conservatives. Now, Mitt Romney will get to, actually, let's take the break so I have time, and we'll be right back.
Mark Levin.
go to Mitt Romney. By the way, I'm not telling you who to vote for. You'll vote for whomever you want. It doesn't do me any good to suggest one person you should vote for, and it doesn't do you any good. You have to be comfortable with your own decision. I'm just exposing this. Now, you're not going to hear this on TV or any other show or anything else or any other place. This is just my background, my own scholarship, my own experience that I'm able to bring to the microphone. You can reject it if you wish. And my proposition to you is that the reason why Romney and Paul can work so easily together is they have a common adversary. Us. Conservatives. Traditional conservatives. Here's Mitt Romney. A lot of talk yesterday about No Child Left Behind, which Santorum voted for. Only 3 Republican senators didn't vote for it. 3 liberal, fairly liberal Republican senators. I pointed out at the time that this was sold as a way to counter the NEA and the teachers union, but I wouldn't have voted for it either. So I'm not trying to make an excuse. I'm trying to explain what occurred at the time. But this was a big issue to Mitt Romney last night, to prove that Rick Santorum is not a conservative. So here's what Mitt Romney said on C-SPAN February 26, 2006, just 6 years ago. Cut 6, go.
There's no question that he's a man of vision, character, and
George Bush.
And knows where he stands. He's also a person who's brought accountability to education. Now, that most of education policy happens at the local level, but at the federal level, by passing No Child Left Behind, we're now able to see which schools are succeeding and failing, and that is ultimately the source of our competitive strength, the ability of our kids to develop the skills to compete over the next century. And that's something he's done with great energy and passion. And I think that fight has to continue.
Okay, so he supported No Child Left Behind. Is he going to repeal it now? I'm just curious. Wasn't asked about it, although a big issue was made about it. Now, much has also been said about Santorum's unfortunate phrase where he said, sometimes you have to be a team player. I would think all the Bushies out there would be excited about that, because that was one of the arguments they made whenever they were doing liberal things, like pushing Harriet Myers, Medicare Part D, No Child Left Behind, and all the other big government things. You had to be a team player. And George W. Bush's guy for delivering that message in the harshest of terms was Karl Rove. Which also raises the question, I thought Santorum was too right-wing to work in the government in an effective way. So he's attacked for that, and he's attacked for this statement. I don't defend this statement, but that's the statement. But I want you to hear this cut 5, and then I guess my question is, what team, Mr. Romney? How about you? Cut 5, go.
I think the old, standby definitions of who votes for which party have been blown away in this campaign. I think people recognize that I'm not a partisan Republican, that I'm someone who is moderate, and that my views are progressive, and that I'm going to go to work for our senior citizens, for people who've been left behind by urban schools that are not doing the right job, and so they're going to vote for me regardless of the party label.
That's just 10 years ago when he was running for governor. Mark, that's 10 years ago. I know, but we're hearing audio and seeing comments that are 20 and 30 years old. And then there's Mitt Romney on the passage of Romney Care in 2006, just 6 years ago. Cut 7, go.
I want to thank the many, many people in this room who were critical to crafting and coaxing the bold health care initiative that I'm about to sign. There are a lot of parents to this initiative, as you know. I'm going to mention a few by name and just a tiny part of their contributions. Senator Kennedy. Together we pitched the secretaries on our vision to ensure all our citizens and on the need for federal support to make the vision real. His work in Washington and behind the scenes on Beacon Hill was absolutely essential. It's now my pleasure to introduce my collaborator and friend, Senator Edward Kennedy. Senator.
Which team, Governor Romney? Which team? I'll be right back.